just in terms of the journey we're going to take in the next hour today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got into the world of responsible AI ethics, a little bit about building my company, and what the landscape looks like for the world of responsible AI. And then we'll talk a little bit about AI and ethics. And then I'm going to end on what might be your journey. I hope it might be your journey in terms of moving into this world as well. I will say I love questions, but I want to hold them until the end. So I'm going to leave some time at the end so that we can have a little bit of Q&A. All right, in terms of where to start this journey, I thought it would be kind of a fun way to kind of just comment on some of what's going on in the popular culture. So some of you might have heard of some of the issues that are happening with these large language models, and one particular issue about glue in pizza. So I just wanted to assure you that's not the case today. Our pizza is definitely glue-free. But I think this is emblematic of some of the things that we're questioning, we're wondering about, or certainly I'm wondering about from the perspective of how we build these technologies and the results that we get. And it got me asking a number of different questions, a lot of why questions, like why do we believe it's acceptable to use the public as a research subject? Why do we privilege things like speed and efficiency, perhaps over things like accuracy and safety? And why do we believe that this particular technology is actually suitable for all of these different applications when we know it's got some problems? So these are the kinds of questions I tend to ask and sit with. And more importantly, kind of diving down to this next level, what are the social, political, economic conditions that kind of underpin all of those decisions? Now, pizza and glue, kind of funny. We all know, that's not the case. But what if the stakes were much higher? What if it was a domain we didn't know anything about, and we were asking these models for information about something and the stakes were high? Then what? So that's when things become really, complicated, let's say. All right, so I want to back up and take you back to my journey into this world. It started back in 2017. So I've been working in media for a very long time, and I had this moment where I decided I wanted to try some new things, didn't really know what they were exactly, and so I decided to go back to school and do a master's degree. And I came here to the University of Alberta to do a degree in communications and technology. And while I was here, I wandered into this lecture that was being given by a prominent AI researcher. He was talking about AI gone wrong, unintended consequences, all of these harms. And he was really concerned about what he saw going on. And so I went up to him afterwards and I said, who is working on this problem? And he told me not enough people. And that's really what sparked my interest in this area of AI ethics. And so I decided to make all of my research about this topic, really hone in on this. And when I graduated in 2020, I decided I want to keep going. I want to keep doing this work. But when I looked around, I didn't really see very many organizations focused on this topic. And so that's what prompted me to launch my own company, Ethically Aligned AI, because I wanted to keep going on this journey. I'm just going to pause for a second because I actually have a draw. If you're interested in what was my research, what did it look like, a lot of it resulted in this ethics tool, which is a reflection journal for people like yourself who are building these technologies. So if you're interested in winning this, I'm going to pass this around. But I'm also going to pass around some paper and a pen to put your name in here, and we'll do a draw afterwards. So I'm just going to launch that off. And my apologies, online people. I don't have a good way of doing this for you, so sorry about that. All right, so that's a little bit about me and how I got started. Let me tell you a bit about the company. So it was fall of 2020. I just finished my master's work, and I was kind of wondering, where am I going to go next? And I got a note from a friend who said, there's this program called the Investment Readiness Program for Social Enterprises. And the deadline's in 1 month, but I think if you pull together something, you probably have a good shot at maybe getting some funding for your company. And so that's exactly what I did. I kind of buckled down, put this grant proposal together, worked really hard to get it in. And my whole idea at that point in time was to do something around auditing AI systems. I had sort of this, I didn't know a lot about audits. I didn't really have a background in financial audits, but I just had this sense that somebody needed to oversee these systems in some way so that we weren't getting these kinds of adverse outcomes. So that's what I pitched. And then I waited and waited for what seemed like a really long time. And I finally got this money at the end of 2020. So the money was really allocated to do a feasibility study. And so the first part of the year, I had 6 months to do the work. There was a deadline to get this done. I was doing this feasibility study and I had this money, so I hired some consultants, brought a team together. We're looking at this space of AI ethics and responsible AI. What does it all mean? We interviewed people and we just wanted to find out where was the market for this idea of AI audits. And what we found out is that in early 2021, there wasn't, as much interest in AI as I thought there was, which really surprised me. So businesses were saying to me, yeah, this AI thing, it's kind of interesting, but I don't know if it's going to impact me at all. And so if it's not going to impact me, why do I need to talk to you about responsible AI if I'm not even sure I'm going to be using AI? So that was kind of the vibe that I was getting from the organizations that I was talking to. And then, unsurprisingly, I also learned that nobody wants to be audited. So, I mean, think about it in your own life. Who wants to sign up to be audited? Probably no one. So that was kind of my core findings at the end of this feasibility study in June of 2021. And it's interesting reflecting on that now from the vantage point of 2024, because of course, the climate for AI is completely different. It's completely shifted. All right, so at that point, I decided I need to start moving forward in some direction, but clearly it wasn't going to be AI audits. And I was very fortunate. I had this relationship with Athabasca University, and they had a vision to make a micro-credential. And they knew I was doing this work in AI ethics, and they asked me if I wanted to be part of that work. And so I signed on with Athabasca University to create what has become Canada's first AI ethics micro-credential. So this was our actual first piece of paid work as a business. And it was good because I was able to really kind of focus. It took about a year to build this micro-credential. There's 4 courses in it. I was able to hire one of the philosophers that I was working with on the feasibility study who became my co-author. And so it was great to kind of have that as a bit of a foundation while I tried to figure out the rest of it. And the rest of it looked like trying to figure out who might be ready to have conversations about responsible AI, who might be ready to have a little bit of advisory work or consulting work. And so that was kind of coming in the door slowly as I was working on these other projects. So since then, I've gone on to do a lot of work in terms of training, workshops, customized training and presentations. I spent some time at the City of Edmonton as their data ethics advisor. Interesting fact, the City of Edmonton is probably the only municipality in Canada that has this role. I did not come across anyone else who has the role of data ethics advisor specifically while I was working at the city. So it's kind of a unique role. It was a unique opportunity to get inside a big organization and kind of figure out how to move this work forward within an organization, because it's one thing to know what the work is, but I think it's another thing to actually see it operationalized and move it forward. So I had a chance to do that. I also had a chance to teach here at the U of A, which I'm super grateful for. I launched a course last summer on AI systems and ethics, and it's a master's level course, and it's going to be running again. It actually starts on Monday. So more kind of opportunities on the training and education side. And then earlier this year, I did some stuff with LinkedIn. And the LinkedIn course was really designed for people who are not building AI systems, but they're buying these systems. And these are just businesses. In fact, in the course, my kind of sample business is a hotel. So you're just running your hotel and all of a sudden all this AI technology is coming along and you're asking yourself, how might I use this responsibly? That's kind of the premise of that course. And of course, I think most companies are going to be in that sort of situation. A lot of companies aren't really building this technology. It's coming into their organization from other places. And then along the way, of course, ethics tools, books like this reflection journal that I've passed around. I've also been kind of on and off working on different software applications too. And so that's kind of a sense of some of the work that I'm doing. And then lots of brand building. So anytime you launch a business, you got to be prepared to be out there, be the face of your organization, get out there, talk to the media about what you're doing. So there were lots of opportunities to do that. One of the things that I've learned about this work is that, and I kind of had this idea going into it, is that it's not going to be really clear cut. It's sort of messy work. And when I was building the brand, I wanted a brand that sort of reflected that idea that we're not always going to get all these things lined up exactly. In fact, we're going to have tensions and trade-offs along the way. You're going to have two competing values, and you're going to have to make some tough decisions. And so the brand sort of is a reminder to me of that messiness inherent with this work. The other thing for me about this work is I do it on two fronts. One is really about risk mitigation, harm reduction, how do we do better given where we're at right now? And that's where I feel a lot of companies want to focus, is just where we're at right now. But the other piece of what I try and do and bring into the conversation is, how do we imagine something totally different? And that might mean starting from a different place. It might mean not centering so much on the technology itself, but taking into consideration all of these other things. So that's kind of the messiness of this kind of work. This is the landscape for AI ethical startup organizations in the last couple of years. This is put together by a group that I don't claim that this is all encompassing, but this group did go to pretty great lengths to try and connect with as many organizations as possible. So back in 2022, what you're seeing is kind of the entirety of the landscape. So people building tools, people kind of putting together fairer data practices, people like myself doing consulting work and that sort of thing. But by 2023, this expanded so much that I didn't actually put the whole thing on this slide. I just cut out the consulting bit. So as you can see, it's still fairly small in terms of the players that are involved. And because it's a startup landscape, they haven't covered the traditional consultancies, like the big four are not represented here. So this is just the independent startup community. So there's still, I think, a ton of opportunity globally for anyone who is interested in building a company in this space. Now, going back to my original plan of audits, I haven't necessarily given up on that. I think a lot has changed in the last couple of years. I feel like we're moving towards that moment where we could get to AI audits. But I've also learned a lot about audits myself. I've learned a lot about what is an audit, and it's different than an assessment. So an assessment is where you work for a company and it's kind of like consulting, sort of like what I do right now. But an audit is really done for the public. And because it's done for the public, you need this independence that happens. You need to be independent. You can't necessarily mark your own homework. That doesn't work. And so what is required for audits is some kind of third-party criteria that is legitimized and that you audit to. And typically that's a regulation of some sort. And I see some inklings of regulation happening. And certainly for things like high-risk applications of AI, I think we're going to get into a stage where audits will be required by some independent source to verify and legitimize things. And so this is all kind of going on. And so I very much am coming back again to this idea of audit. Okay, so that's a little bit about my journey so far. I want to turn now and talk a little bit about AI, but perhaps not from the typical perspective that you think about AI. So what I want to do is, I don't want to just focus on the technical pieces of AI. Certainly, you know, as computer scientists, AI researchers, you know a lot about that. We're not going to cover that today. I think it's important to consider that. But I also want you to maybe consider the bigger picture of what you're building in the bigger context. So there are cultural perspectives on technology. There are ways in which technology and culture work together. And there are also even bigger picture perspectives. We can think about AI and digital systems in general as a form of infrastructure. And as a form of infrastructure, they have all kinds of consequences for our economy, for politics, for the environment, all of these other pieces. So it's about really, we can think about the technology, but I think it's important to kind of pull back and think more holistically about things. This is another way of framing that. This is some work by Blair Attard-Frost that I've adapted. So Blair is doing their PhD at the University of Toronto. And I really am a fan of their work. And so the way this is organized is thinking about it computationally, that would be the technical, but then thinking perhaps about how people intersect with this, the socio-technical. And then moving beyond that, thinking about the ecosystem and thinking about concerns like labor conditions and the environment and the ways in which everything is interconnecting together. And so if we start to think about this technology in that way, we start to see different kinds of ethical concerns arise. And the way I've kind of mapped this or thought about it is sort of in different waves. So when we think about like the first wave of ethics, it was all about, we need to get some principles here. And everybody was trying to do that back in 2018. Let's get a committee, let's get some principles. What's our perspective? And I'm not saying that's wrong or bad. In fact, I think that's a good thing. But if you leave it there and don't go anywhere else with it, you're kind of missing the next layers. So it's, there's that piece of it. There's then thinking about the ways in which those principles inform the technology, how you're going to use this technology, and then how that intersects with bigger systems. So when we think about machine learning, this is from an open source book, Fair ML book. It's online. The whole thing is great if you're interested in this topic. And what I like about this quote is sort of this idea that we already know that machine learning works best in this static, stable world. So this is what they're saying. So the more dynamic things get, the less things get certainty we have in terms of how things are going to turn out. So if that's true, at the same time, we want to apply these technologies everywhere. When we think about what's more dynamic than a human life, I mean, our lives are dynamic. The world is dynamic. Things are happening all the time that we don't expect. COVID, is an example of that. And so we want to use these technologies everywhere, even if we know that they're not necessarily the best thing to use. And that creates all these adverse consequences for different groups of people. So when we're using these technologies to judge who should get a job, who should get a loan, who should get access to healthcare, we have these things flooding the environment with misinformation. We have these big questions about what does it mean when ChatGPT comes into the realm of education or any other realm and disrupts things. So there's all these bigger questions that happen when we bring these technologies in and then kind of sprinkle them everywhere. And so one of the questions I sit with a lot is this idea of prediction. Are we actually predicting the future, or are we prescribing the future in some way? So we have data, which by definition is historical. We have this past that we then use to make some decisions about a future, and then we want to intervene in that in some way to guide it. And in some ways, that kind of predetermines things. And so this is something that I think we need to really think about. Is it prediction? Is it prescription? Maybe it's a little of both. Another question that I have is around this idea of who has authority. And I think we see this in our own lives. It shows up in small ways. So if we think about how do we feel about ourselves when we're confronted with our data, like some of us have Fitbits, and you hear the stories about people gaming their Fitbit so they can get their 10,000 steps, so they can feel good about themselves. They can feel like the kind of person who did 10,000 steps because they have the data to prove that they did it. So it's those kinds of small things. But I think there's like bigger questions about what does this mean when a machine is believed, perhaps, or the data or evidence is believed over a person. I've been spending a lot of time with a group at For Humanity, the group that's putting together some of the audit criteria for AI, and we've been talking a lot about workplace surveillance. And I spend time in this world, and I'm even shocked by what's going on out there. And this idea of what will be believed, will it be your digital AI coworker who's kind of ratted you out, or is the boss going to believe you? These kinds of questions I think are really interesting. And then I think about this idea of datification and objectification. So as we turn ourselves into data, as we turn people into data, is there some sort of objectification happening here? And to what degree do we want to do this? I mean, clearly there are upsides to this. Coincidentally, I just got this kind of, I guess, catalog or magazine from CFAR. I'm on their mailing list. And they're talking about this article in it called, How Do We Create a Google Map of the Human Body? And it kind of goes into great detail about who's doing this research and what they're trying to do. And it's very interesting. And you can clearly see there are benefits for doing something like that in terms of advancing medicine. But also, I think we need to think carefully about the downsides of that too. Like, what might be the downsides or the negative consequences when we turn ourselves into data? Are we in some ways objectifying people in ways that could lead to negative consequences? All right, so I want to talk a tiny bit about ethics. These, I would say, are kind of the big 5 things that I encounter in my work. So privacy is paramount. Everybody has concerns about their data. And part of this is we have privacy laws. So there's an element of compliance here, like we need to be on side with the laws. We need to make sure we're not offside. So privacy is something that gets talked about a lot. Fairness is also something that gets talked about a lot as well. So this idea of algorithmic bias, I would argue we care about bias because we actually care about fairness. We care about fairness because we care about justice. And we want to make sure people are not being discriminated against, that people are being treated fairly. And so there's a lot to say about that. The next two, transparency and explainability, kind of linked together. So transparency is about this idea that we should disclose things. So you should know when you're chatting with a bot. You should know when text is coming from an AI system. You should be aware of that. And there's sort of this respect for persons that goes behind that. We don't want to deceive you. We don't want to disrespect you in any way. But transparency can also relate to this idea of how have we actually built these technologies? So what data has gone into the technology, what kind of choices were made about this model, how is it actually coming to some kind of an output? And I think that starts to get into this idea of explainability, because sometimes we might know the inputs, and then something happens in the middle, and then we get an output. And this sort of black box effect, this idea that we're not really sure what exactly is going on in the middle, can be really challenging for people in terms of their agency, in terms of their autonomy. And in some contexts in particular, it becomes really important to have an explanation for someone about why a decision was made. And so this whole field of XAI, as they call it, explainable AI, there are researchers working on this. You have an XAI lab here at the University of Alberta. I believe it's still headed up by Randy Gable. It is, yeah. So Randy's working on this problem. And there are other people, of course, working on this too. And it becomes really important to have some kind of explanation to give to people in certain contexts. And then there's this idea of accountability. So who's going to be responsible? How do we contest things? When an AI system makes a decision about you, how do you contest that? How do you redress that? What are the mechanisms? So this all comes up as part of the Big Five. I want to layer on two more things. One thing that I think doesn't really come up as much, but I think it should, is the environment. And this isn't necessarily, I think, an issue for all of AI, but certainly as we move into these large language models and we build larger and larger things that are using more and more resources, more and more data centers, I think we need to really think about the impacts environmentally of some of those technologies and ask ourselves, do we want to make some different design choices? Could we make different kinds of systems that are effective, but aren't necessarily just these massive things that use a lot of energy? So that's kind of one question. And then kind of thinking about your role in all of this, and I say your role, we all have a role, of course, in this, but you as designers, I think, have a really particular role to play in terms of being able to make a lot more choices about how the technology is going to be designed and what it's going to look like. And so distributed responsibility, it's sometimes called the many hands problem, and it relates to this idea that there's a lot of people involved in various parts of the chain that are making decisions about how this technology will be built. And so it's really easy to say, well, you know, I didn't collect the data, so I don't really know anything about the data. Or, you know, I'm just doing like this section over here. Someone else is doing, you know, that piece and I don't know what they're doing. And so you have this sort of capacity to say, well, I'm just doing my thing. And so I'm good. I'm not really responsible. And so I think that we need to think about like, what is our responsibility in the role that we play? Even if you think, well, I'm just a researcher. I'm just doing research. How could I be responsible for anything? I think, you know, the movie Oppenheimer goes into that in a bigger way. But these are the kinds of things I think we need to think about as we're moving forward with AI. All right, so data models and people. I'm just going to touch on this a little bit fairly briefly, but this was the framework that I came up with to help myself, a non-technical person, kind of think through some of these things and where might the ethical issues be entangled in this process. And so I'm just going to step through this pretty quickly for you, starting with this idea of what we believe data can do. So we have a collective belief, this is pretty much a Western perspective, that data is going to give us the truth. We're going to be data-driven. We're going to get to the cold, hard facts and the evidence, and that is what data is all about. And that's kind of this core foundational belief in our society. But data is actually flawed. You, as people who work with data, you probably see the ways that data is flawed in the course of the work that you do. Sometimes, you know, you have some data, but there's a bunch of data missing. So now what are we going to do about that? We got to figure out how we're going to address that. Sometimes data was mismeasured, and maybe you don't even know that it's not accurate. You think that that pulse oximeter, it got the correct blood oxygen level readings on everyone, and yet it's been shown that persons with darker skin, that particular device doesn't work as well, and so maybe there's something wrong in the data that you've got. And then there's historical data. So the Prime Ministers of Canada data set is a small data set. We can all look at it. We can see that there's only one woman in this data set. Everyone else is a man. Everybody in the data set is white. Everyone in this data set, if we were to look at their socioeconomic background, we see a particular class of person that's been Prime Minister of Canada. And we know why that is. We know there's a whole bunch of social reasons, political reasons why that data looks the way it is. And yet there's a lot of historical data that's being used in these models as well. Someone, yeah, give your hand up.
The slides are not showing up on the Zoom.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
The slides are not showing up on the Zoom.
Oh, they're not coming up on Zoom? Okay, I'm not sure why that is. So maybe if you bear with us for 1 minute.
Is it okay if I end?
Sure. Do you want to see if the screen was shared, right?
Yeah, it's just stuck on like the on like the first slide, so I'm just trying to see. I'm just gonna
Is that for everyone or just one person? Because I've had it for
everybody.
everybody. Okay.
I'm just
All
gonna
right.
double check to see if it.
Okay. Do you want me to just move to the next slide and see if everyone?
Yeah, it's showing 27.
Okay.
Much better, thank you.
That's better?
Much better.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Rich. Okay. All right. So we have all this bias kind of coming into these models. Not easy to fix it. There's a sense that we'll just clean it up on the back end. We'll filter it. Not an easy thing to do, as Google has found out. All right, so moving on to the idea of models, moving away from data. So Kathy O'Neill is a famous data scientist. She wrote this book called Weapons of Math Destruction. And she says that models are opinions embedded in math. And what she means by this is that there's a lot of choices that go into constructing a model. And you know this because you're designers and you get to make these choices. You get to decide what are the features we're going to pay attention to, what are the things we're not going to pay attention to, what are the things we're going to optimize for, what's our real truth. All of these kinds of decisions, you get to make those. And so all of those kind of find their way into our models as well. And so if we think about the why behind all of this, like why are we doing this? What's the driver? Kind of pulling back and going into the people part of the framework. I kind of trace it, at least in modern times, to this phenomenon of Moneyball. So this is a story that goes back to the baseball team, the Oakland A's. And back in the early 2000s, they weren't doing so well. They were losing a lot of games. They didn't have money to go and hire superstar players to turn some things around. So they turned to the data, and baseball as a game has a lot of data, a lot of statistics, and they did some analysis, and they found some things out, they made some different decisions, they started winning games, it was a big success story. Michael Lewis comes along, he writes a book about it called Moneyball, and then of course a movie is made about it starring Brad Pitt, and it just hits the cultural zeitgeist, and everybody wants to moneyball their organization. Governments and industry, it's all over the place. And when I say everybody, I literally mean everybody. Taco Bell and Pizza Hut are kind of going in, all in on this Moneyball, AI first kind of strategy. I've got a bit of a pizza theme here today. And so this is really something I think that isn't new. It's part of this continuance in terms of AI being kind of the latest iteration added to this whole Moneyball phenomenon. Now, another part of this story too is this idea of automation. And what we're seeing is the capacity for AI to automate more and more knowledge work. But what we've seen, if we look back at the history of automation, because automation itself isn't really a new thing, we can see that automation has some consequences. So this is from a book called Power and Progress. And the author talks about this idea of inequality being part of the automation story. And so this, again, going back to those kind of negative consequences, because there's been an awful lot of great things that have happened as a result of automation, but there's also these negative consequences. But optimistically, he also says it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. There's a particular set of conditions that make it so. And so the book kind of goes into more of that. But it got me thinking about the sharing problem, because that really, to me, is what it comes down to, is that when we're not sharing, and then you can talk about resources, you can talk about pizza, you can talk about the world, this to me is sort of the core of the problem. So in a lot of cases, it's not just about the technology by itself, it's sort of the technology as it exists within the bigger system, going back to where we started the presentation. All right, so I want to turn now in the last part of this talk and talk about your journey into this world. I'm hoping you might want to make one. And before we do that, though, I'm just going to play this little video. I like to make these little videos to kind of spark conversation. And this is some advice on getting hired.
Hi, I'm a synthetically generated AI voice representing Jared Thomas, head of HR and people operations at Big Company. We pride ourselves on honesty and transparency. That's why it's important for you to know that here at Big Company, our most valuable asset is money. But our second most valuable asset is people. And I'm proud to be the person in charge of ensuring we attract and retain great people. Because hiring great people helps us to make more money. It's a win-win. When it comes to finding top talent, we pride ourselves on casting a wide net. We welcome a diverse range of applicants from many different backgrounds and walks of life. Just like we say on our website and on every job posting. We are firmly committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Should you apply for a role at Big Company, and we hope you do, your application will be rigorously screened by our thorough and objective, scientifically verified artificial intelligence screening process. Our automated systems are calibrated to sort through the thousands of applications we receive daily and get to the truly high-caliber talent. These systems are incredibly efficient, removing those who have odd-sounding names or don't play the right sports or who might be the statistically determined wrong gender for the role. Now, we know that last point might be controversial or maybe illegal, but it's real, because science. Who are we to argue with an algorithm? We take all of these highly relevant points into consideration, along with other important success metrics that are determined to weed out the less qualified applicants. It's all part of our secret sauce. Our focus on efficiency and money is how we've become the world's largest global institution. If you are shortlisted and invited to an interview, congratulations. You'll get to meet with Garcia, our generic applicant response screening interviewer. Garcia is super fun. You'll spend a couple hours together online answering a few questions, while Garcia watches your facial expressions and monitors your tone of voice, so it can calculate your score. Then, it's game time. You'll play some scientifically developed games and complete a personality assessment that will determine if you're the right fit for Big Company. Now, let me give you a huge tip. If you play baseball or lacrosse, or your name is Thomas or Jared, then you're going to breeze through this process. I got some extra points for being named Jared Thomas, so take it from me as someone who's been there and done that. I look forward to welcoming you to our team here at Big Company, where science and efficiency drive our highly impersonal hiring process so that we can get the best qualified people as part of our one big happy family. Because as I've said many times, people are our second most important asset. Good luck.
All right, so of course, hiring is one of the areas where AI is being used. There's been a lot of concerns around bias in the hiring process. We've actually just seen our first lawsuit globally around this. So hiring it's already been identified as one of those high-risk areas that I think are going to need to be audited. All right, so let's talk about jobs though, in responsible AI, AI ethics, sometimes it's called AI governance. There's a lot of different ways to frame this. There are jobs that are there, as I was saying, still in the startup phases, it's still a little bit nascent, But certainly there's roles in education and research. That's been going on for a little bit longer. In terms of doing the work that I'm doing, increasingly there are organizations that are standing up their own AI ethics teams. That's certainly one of the recommendations I have for any organization that wants to build or deploy these technologies, is that they have that kind of team. And then we're kind of getting towards that idea of auditing. So right now, I think there's a lot of overlap. So if you're a generalist, it's kind of a good time to be in this space. But I do think at some point we'll probably get to more specializations because it's important that someone really understand the context, for example, of working in the healthcare space. So that's what the market looks like right now. In terms of the kind of person that is a good fit for this space, well, if you're not very curious and you just want someone to hand you a playbook and these are the exact things that you're going to have to do, and you're not super diplomatic, this is probably not the best space for you, I would say. So having a sense of curiosity, being able to have the courage to say some things that are uncomfortable, to speak up, being willing to have that pioneering spirit. And that's a little bit because this is such a new space. I would say this is the case for any new space. You have to be willing to kind of go in there and hack your way through the jungle a little bit and figure out how to do things. And then this idea of being diplomatic, I think is really important. And this is something that I've learned in my time in this space. You can't just go in there guns blazing with your AI ethics hammer that you're wielding. You have to kind of meet people where they're at. You have to kind of take a look at the landscape, understand what's important to the people that you are serving in this role. So these are the kind of aptitudes that I think are a good fit. In terms of technology roles, what I'm seeing is that these kinds of AI ethics skills training are in some cases being woven into some of the technical roles. So there's a sense that it would be great to have people who understand fair ML practices or privacy or explainable AI working in companies. And I think we're also starting to see some changes in terms of what's being taught at universities to really start to enable that as well. I heard from one person, this is kind of an interesting story, that they were telling me, I was giving this AI ethics talk to a bunch of data scientists, and they were telling me that they had interviewed for a job recently, and unfortunately they didn't get the job because they didn't have the responsible AI side of it. So I thought that's kind of an interesting, maybe early indicator. I certainly don't think that having any of these skills would harm you, and I think it could definitely give you an advantage in terms of the job market.
My name is Jared.
And I'm coming up to the end and then we'll do questions. What can you do right now? There's lots of things that you can do. A lot of them are free. You can volunteer. I've mentioned For Humanity. They're working on AI audit criteria. There's all kinds of other groups that you can get involved with. There's lots of ways just to learn more about this topic that are freely available. So whether you like to read, whether you like to listen to things like podcasts or videos, there's lots of great material out there. If you feel so inclined, you can take some training. I've mentioned some of the courses that I've been involved in building, but there's lots of other free resources out there as well. And then there is, I would say, the communities that are really important to network with that aren't maybe directly AI ethics, but I consider them adjacent. So things like privacy, cybersecurity, data management. I'm involved in all of these groups. I'll mention that I'm actually the chapter chair for Edmonton of the IAPP. So if you're interested in privacy, let me know, and I'll make sure to keep you posted about various upcoming events where you can meet other people who are interested in that. All right, so I hope this is kind of been a pitch to you to take a step, to join the journey, to put responsible AI into your world in some way. You can start small with something, just going and looking something up on YouTube, or maybe a bit bigger if you want to kind of dive into it in a bigger way. But most importantly, I think it's important that we have fun while we're doing this work. And so I'm going to give Jared Thomas the last word.
Hi, this is the synthetically generated voice of Jared Thomas, head of HR at Big Company. Are you as excited about the AI future as we are? This just might be the opportunity for you. Big Company is a leading global institution that boasts a market capitalization that rivals the GDP of a small nation-state. We are actively implementing AI-enabled automation across our entire organization, outsourcing the inefficiencies of various administrative, marketing, communications, and management functions to big GPTs. Big GPTs are customized versions of our proprietary extra large language model chatbots that augment the work of the small human team still employed at our organization. Big GPT is very good, but it's not always 100% accurate. It also lacks that good old human touch of empathy. That's why we need an assistant for our AI assistants. In this exciting role of AI assistant team lead, you'll be responsible for managing your very own AI team. You'll review their work, suggest improvements to help train the next version of the system, handle those situations that only a human can handle, and most importantly, be the human in the loop required for us to maintain our regulatory compliance. If this sounds exciting, we'd love to hear from you.
All right, and we're at the end. So if you want to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn quite a bit, and I blog at ethicallyalignedai.com if you want to read some of my work. But for now, we've got some time for questions. I'm actually not quite sure how much time we have because we've restarted our PowerPoint, and I'm not sure what time it is anymore, but
I think it's so far.
oh, 12:41. Okay, perfect. We're like right on time. So yeah, I'm happy to take questions from the room. If you're on Zoom, maybe just, can they unmute themselves? Yeah, okay. If you're on Zoom, feel free to unmute yourself. I don't know if I can see all your hands or not. Just yeah, just go ahead and jump in. So yeah, questions.
Good.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned like auditing AI quite a lot. What do you expect the outcomes of like, what happens after the audit? Like someone's doing something unethical, what do you just like your black is?
Yeah, I think so. There's different kinds of audits. There's like a technical audit where you can kind of see what the outcomes of a system are going to be. And then if it doesn't pass a particular set of outcomes, it might get sent back, might not get released into the world. So that's kind of one possibility. There's also procedural audits, which are more about, did you do these things? And so you're auditing to a set of processes, which you hope will lead to a better outcome. I think both are important, like having the practices in place, like, do you have an AI ethics committee? Were they consulted? Those kinds of questions. And so having those criteria is really important. And each, I'll say each context might be a little bit different too, in terms of what the criteria is. But this isn't really all that different than product. I mean, why do we know that these chairs, we walk in a room, there's a bunch of chairs, we know they're safe for us to use, they're not gonna, fall apart the minute we sit on them. It's because they've gone through some process of some sort. And I think that for a bunch of reasons, historically, software hasn't necessarily had to go through that process. I think I might have, was there another hand over here or no? Okay.
Can you give
Yeah,
some examples of things that have failed the audits? Yeah.
Well, there aren't really any audits at the moment, right? Like, so this is a little hypothetical. This is in terms of like, I think there's lots of examples of AI that's failed. I mean, I think that's kind of where we're at right now. But we don't have audits, I would say partially because we don't have regulation. So what are we auditing to? What's the standard that we've agreed to? And then, all the infrastructural, who's going to do those audits and how do we train those people? And that's why I think there's interesting opportunities for people who want to be involved with that. We're going to need technical people to be part of that. It's not just about the processes or thinking through the ethics. That's certainly important. But at the end of the day, someone's also going to have the technical savvy to actually do some of the technical audit work. Yeah.
So we're building this ethical AI environment here in Canada. How does that compare to places like Russia and China that are using it for perhaps not so ethical use? And how do we expect that to work against each other?
Yeah, I think that, there's always going to be bad actors for sure. And there's always going to be different groups that have different sets of values. And so part of what, like For Humanity is a US-led global effort. So we're trying to be as inclusive as possible and having a wide variety of people around the table sort through that. But I think we can't use that as an excuse not to do some of this. So I think if we kind of go, well, it's sort of like that, so-and-so's going to jump off a bridge, so I should too, kind of an argument. And I'm like, okay, but, I think it's about trying to do the best that we can, understanding, again, going back to the messiness, of the world even, that's not gonna be perfect, but at least I'm gonna try. I'm gonna take that step forward.
Hey, I
Oh,
have a question.
yes.
We've spoken a lot in generalities. Can we have even one example of harm that AI has done?
Yeah, can I go back to the slide? I'm just gonna go through the deck real quick here. Because there's so many examples. I mean, you could say that that lawsuit, I'll just pause on a couple things. So here's a lawsuit of someone who didn't get hired because of bias in a system. Here is, oh, here's the representation of various diversity in things that are really offensive to people, quite frankly. So there's a harm there. And
Excuse
then
me,
there's this part.
but offending people, I'm not sure that's really a harm. I mean, people have free speech, and we're encouraged to say everything we want to say. And if people are offended, that's a kind of harm. I don't think it rises to the word harm. No one is actually hurt by it.
Yeah, so I think harms and wrongs, I think sometimes can get mixed together for sure. So, I mean, if we want to talk about a harm, there was a dog that was killed by the self-driving car. There's people who didn't get opportunities. So, there's people who have been falsely accused of things. There's a case of Rite Aid. I don't have it in this deck, but this is an interesting case. So Rite Aid is a big American drugstore chain. And they kind of rolled out facial recognition technologies without a lot of training. The camera lightings were different in various stores. And so what happened is they started accusing a bunch of customers, mostly customers of color, of shoplifting, and then kind of dragging them to the side. It was embarrassing. In some cases, it did result in, the wrongful arrest. And so the FTC said to Rite Aid, look, you need to be responsible for this technology because it's causing a lot of harm to people. And they sanctioned them and said, no more facial recognition technology for you for 5 years. So that's an example. There's actually a great database called the AI Incident Database, if you want to look it up. And it goes through all the different kinds of examples that people are cataloging. So those are just some examples of harm.
So those are examples of people misusing AI.
It's more complicated than that. I think there's, whenever we have technologies, they enable certain things. And so I think, could Rite Aid have done what they did without that technology? So, you think about the practicalities of installing a system like facial recognition versus hiring 10 security guards who are going to stand at every door and look at everybody, look at every customer and see who looks like they might be shoplifting. And then you kind of have this capacity for new things to happen when you have a technology. So I think there's kind of this, again, this symbiotic relationship between what the technology enables.
I guess it's fine to say it enables it, but I wouldn't say it did it. It enables people to do, a lot of those problems are the people's misuse of it. I just think we should need to be careful when AI is actually causing harm, or if people are just making stupid decisions using computation and technology. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I would dispute that line of questioning actually, because I think there's faulty reasoning there. The fact that clearly there are documented cases, but the fact that that you can point, the fact that it hurts one person or it may hurt a group, thinking the judicial system or an AI system may be biased against a certain subgroup in the population. And there are cases that it's not where the AI is being applied, it's the fact that, as you point out, there's a larger context within which it's created and it's implemented. And so understanding the ethics of it means unpacking the process all the way back to the motivation for creating it in the first place. And so to suggest, I think the line of questioning is suggesting that it's only how AI is applied, which is the ethical question. I would disagree with that and say that it is the entire production process, right? to the beginning, which is why are we building this thing in the first place? That needs to be discussed, right? And when you talk about organizations that are perhaps purchasing AI services, think about financial organizations, right? They need to reassure their customers that the systems they're using are going to do what they say they do. Because there's a lot at stake, and then you can think about healthcare and other things. And not every organization is going to be in a position to understand the nature of the system that they're acquiring. So the kind of role that you're playing and the kind of job that you're talking about do have an important role going forward in terms of understanding the potential implication of these technologies. And to just bury our heads in the sand and say, oh, they won't do any harm, we don't have any immediate evidence of large-scale harm, I think is foolhardy.
Thank you. Was there another hand up? I'm not sure, kind of lost track. Yeah.
My question was like, John, do oppose the idea that AI and ethics like should be controlled by the government, like audits, sort of like FAA or like health regulations for like, do you think AI should be controlled by the government, like any of it?
Yeah, so governments have traditionally played that role of the backstop or the regulator, the counterweight to what, industry just wants to do, right? So industry will move forward in every way that it can, doing what it can for its business. Everybody kind of looking out for their own interests, and that makes sense. So what's going to be the backstop or the counterweight? Traditionally, that's been the role that government and regulation has played. Governments also want to be careful. They don't want to stifle innovation either. So they're kind of playing this balancing role. So I think what's happened is it's swung very far in one direction. And so we're trying to get it back to put in place some helpful regulation. Certainly a process to do that for sure, to make sure it goes through the proper, democratic channels for social legitimacy and all of those kinds of reasons. So does that kind of answer your question? I'm not sure what the question was exactly. Is why should government make regulation or?
My question was like having AI auditing company, should that be an external party or should that be just the government itself doing all those audits?
Or who should do the audits? Is that what you're asking us? Yeah. So, I think what we see certainly in the financial world is kind of a little of both. So you have the kind of, hopefully you never get this call, the CRA phoning you and it's like, hey, we're going to have to audit you and review things. So that's like the government auditing you. But we also have audits that are done by industry as well. So you have consulting firms that come along and they do audits for organizations. When I worked in the not-for-profit space, we would do either an audit or review engagement, which is where you hire the independent firm to come in with your books and make sure everything looks good. And that's sort of the role of audit that's done by independent players. I kind of think it's going to be a little bit of both. I don't think government has, again, the capacity, the resources, the people to do that kind of work all by itself. Any other questions?
Sorry, can I ask a question just before you end?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm actually not a designer. I'm an interculturalist with the university in and I became really interested in the way AI could be used to help in student services and to help with education. I've read a lot of papers about biases and data, and I'm very concerned about bringing AI into the institutions where we have a very diverse student population. And as well, I read recently that the government is now using AI in order to assess whether students are eligible for study permits. And, they're indicating that there are a lot of biases in there that are excluding people from certain countries. So my question is, one, how do we fix the bias? You sort of started talking about it, but you didn't really say anything about maybe how those biases are being rectified. And, what do you think of the ethics within post-secondary institutions and the way that they're being used or in government organizations?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of questions there. I'll try and unpack them. So in terms of so first of all, AI is not one thing. I've been talking about it like it's one thing, like there's the monolithic AI out there, and that's certainly not the case. There's a whole range of technologies that we're talking about. So if you're going to get more practical in terms of addressing a situation, you have to know what specific AI tool or technology or system are we talking about, and look at the specific ways in which that particular tool was made, like i.e. what's gone into it, what kind of biases are we talking about, has it been tested by someone, who is that someone, all of those kinds of more specific questions. Where is the data going? Like, kind of getting into the weeds here. I didn't have time with a lunchtime talk like this to really go into that too much. That's a lot of work. And so going back to regulation, that's kind of the role of regulators. Like, you don't walk into a grocery store and ask yourself, as you look at every package of meat on the shelf, is this safe? Is this safe? Is this safe? Because you know that some processes happen that says if it's in Safeway, it's pretty good unless a recall has been issued. So that's kind of where we need to get to. In terms of how to actually address the bias, I think part of that goes back to, well, what particular bias is being exhibited, and then how might that have arisen under the conditions of which that particular tool is made. And again, that's super context specific and not easy to do. If you're someone who's buying tech, I think you need to throw that back on the vendor in a lot of cases. And I suppose your recourse or your choice as a consumer is to decide not to use it. So I hope that sort of answers your question. Again, I can't get into a lot of specifics without like really understanding exactly what the tool is and whether it's data or whether it's some other thing that might be driving to a bias.